So for the first part of assignment 5, we're going to have you implement an adapter pattern in C Sharp. So I've created a project that needs it, and I'm going to walk you through that. This is a Windows Forms project, so I'm going to introduce you to Windows Forms projects. These are created, we haven't looked at one of these yet. When you go to File, New Project, one of the options there is a Windows Forms projects. These just run in Windows. So rather than a console application that's just text, Windows Form application is a nice GUI interface with Windows and stuff like that. So we'll be looking at these fairly regularly now that we're getting into more complicated programs. Similarly, we'll look at websites and using those. But this is the first time seeing in Windows Form application, so I'll just give you a quick overview of that. It has a form. When you create that, it has a default form called Form 1. If I open that up, it'll open it up in design view. You see the design view here, and I can see it's a GUI interface. I can drag and drop controls here. So with this form, there should also be a toolbox here with some common controls, lots of controls, but the most ones we use are under common controls. And there's things like buttons that we can drag and drop, labels, text boxes and combo boxes, stuff like that we can create forms with. So I've created a simple form for a patient insurance check. It has a combo box for a patient's name and information, a button here. So there's two combo boxes, two text fields, and these are all labels here, and a button. And then behind this form is some code. So if I double click on either like the form heading or this button, it'll go into, again, the same form.cs file, but this is in the code view, and so I'll see the code. This is in the button click method because I double clicked on the button. And there's also a form load method. If I double click on the top bar, it'll bring me to the form load event and set that up for me. So those are set there. Now, when I run this, it'll run as a Windows form. It takes a bit to compile the first time, or if we made changes, so I can see the little compile button going down here. So here it pops up under the name field. I can select some names. These are just some faculty here. Some procedures. I used complicated medical procedure names here. And then I can fill in an amount charged, and then it should check for coverage and tell me the amount that's covered by this person. And different people have different insurance company coverage in different ways. I think, let's see, Jen has a different one. So you'll see different values here depending on what you select. Okay, I'm going to stop this. So that's the form interface. There is a main program under programs.cs, but we generally don't look and do anything with that. It just creates a form 1 and starts it up. So we never really have to look at the program interface. And then I've added a couple things to this for this to work. And that's an interface for processing the insurances and in-network patients and out-network patients, and we'll look at those in just a sec. So let's look first at the interface. So in order to process payments from for this, we need every patient to have a couple methods. We have an is covered method that takes a string patient name and a string policy number. We need a coverage amount where if we pass in a procedure ID as an integer and a procedure amount as a decimal, again we're using decimal for money currency values, then this should return the coverage amount as a decimal. And then finally we need a get patient name here that should return a string of the patient. So this is an interface that every patient should implement. So our in-network patient does this. So here's our in-network patient, and it implements that interface. And so we can see it has a bunch of stuff here, but it has a coverage amount. Again, in our interface, we have a coverage amount with these an integer and a decimal, coverage amount, integer, decimal, returning a decimal. So that's that code. And then we have an is covered method that just returns true or false, returns a Boolean, and then the get name here. So some of these are relatively simple. So inside our in-network patient, we have a name attribute or property, a policy number, policy level, and this is one of three levels that's stored as an enum, silver, gold, or platinum, depending on what level they're at, and a date time for the date of birth. And so we have a name field or name attribute here. So get name, get patient name just returns that. Now there's already a getter and a setter for that name property, but again, the interface requires that we have something called get name exactly that way and returns a string. So we have to make sure we have a method called that to implement that. So our form is set up to implement a couple of these inpatient patients that implement this interface already, so we can see how that works. So if I go into the form and I double click on this bar at the top, I'll get to the form load event. Or if I just open it up in non-design view, there are form load events. So it creates a number of patients, these in-network patients, and with different policy levels and some made-up numbers. So we create these in-network patients, and then we have to add them to this box up here. Just again, a couple quick steps here. In our form, we have these combo boxes, and so when we run it, remember it displays. It can display the patient's name up here or the types of injuries or procedures. Now there's a couple ways of doing this in C#. One is we can hard code it. So every object over here has some properties that we can set. The font, the width, all this sort of stuff we can set over in this properties window. And one of those for combo box is the items. I can go down to items and click on that, and I can hard code in the items. I can just type in the items here, and that's what I've done for procedures. But for like patients, that will be changing or might change. So there the collection is blank, there's nothing added, and so in the code we're going to add something to that. So that combo box is called CB name is the name of this combo box. I've given it that name so that in my form I after I create these patients, I go cbname.items.add, and then I get the patient's name and add them to that combo box. Okay. Now the patients themselves are stored in an array, not exactly an array, a list, which is like an array, so similar to an array. So I have a list of that. Now it's interesting to note that this is a list of insurance interfaces, not in-network patients. So I'm using the interface for this list because I'm going to have both in-network and out-of-network patients added to this list eventually. So I've got a list, so I'm using the interface here. So here's my patients, and so when I create a new patient here, I add it to my list. This is my array or my list here that I'm adding it to. So every time I create a patient, I add it to the list, and then I'm going to go through and do a for each. Hopefully you've seen for each loops before, just like we can do for each with an array or an array list. I can do for each item in patients, which is my list. Now again, I'm going to go and grab, since this is a list of insurance interfaces, I'm going to say for each insurance interface patient in patient and patient. So I can use, since I'm using this interface, I'm limited. I can only use the methods defined in the interface. There are more methods here in the patient, but again, I'm limited to only using these three methods that are in the interface because of the way I'm declaring this variable. This insurance interface patient or pat is in patients, so I have to use that there. So this is how I add things. Now we're going to add some more stuff to this code in just a sec. So, but again, this runs fine for in-network patients. Now we're going to go to out-of-network patients. Okay, so let's look at the out-of-network patients. The idea here with out-of-network patients is this is code that you can't change, that's fixed. So maybe it's defined by an outside vendor, and these methods and this whole thing is put in here. In fact, I was going to give this to you just as a DLL, as a link library you bring in and use, but sometimes I find that confusing for students if they can't see the actual code here. So I've given you the actual code, but I don't want you to change it. So you should never change anything in out network patients.cs. This file should be locked. You can't change it. So assume again it's by a third vendor, it's in some place you can't change, it's in a language you can't change, something like that. But let's just look at what it does. So out network patients, it does not implement an interface. And again, we can't put that, we can't do any changes here. So we can't do like in network patients, we just can't add that there. So we can't do anything there. It doesn't implement our interface yet, or the way we want it. It has a constructor with a name and a policy number. It doesn't have policy levels. And again, we have some attributes, name, policy number, date of birth. We have coverage percent. So if you remember, in-network patient had coverage amount. This just has coverage percent. Out-of-network patients, this interface is very simple. It just looks at the procedure cost, and if it's less than $1,000, you get reimbursed 50%. Otherwise, you get reimbursed 25%. And this is again returning a coverage percent for us. Let me make sure I put a comment in here so that is a little clearer. Turns the percent of the procedure cost that are covered. Okay, so it just returns that percent. So it's different than what we want. We want a coverage amount. Let's see what else it has. It has an is covered, but it's interesting to note that I shouldn't say this here. Sorry, I left over that this returns true or, instead of true or false, it returns yes as a string if covered. And our interface is going to want us to return a Boolean is covered here. So we're going to have to work with that. And that's really common with this adapter pattern to have to do some adapting and stuff like that. Now get patient string, get patient returns name. That's exactly what we want, and it's the same as over here. So that'll make our lives easier. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to walk you through the first part of this. So we're going to, we've got our outpatient. We're going to create an adapter, because again, we can't just create and use this outpatient in our form. For example, if we try to do that here, okay, if we try to add a new patient here, trying to create a new out network patient, calling the constructor, and again, the constructor is a little different here, but I'm calling it correctly, and try to add this to my list here of patients, everything in my list has to implement this interface, and it gives me this error: cannot convert from out network patient to insurance interface. It can't convert to this interface because this out network patient doesn't implement that interface. So we can't do that. That's not going to work. So that's why we need an adapter class. So we're going to create a new class here that's going to implement the interface and do our adapter. So let's do that. Project, add class, and we're going to call this an out network adapter, and there'll be a class. Okay, so here's our class out network adapter, and it's going to implement our interface, our insurance interface for us. And so that right away, one way to get this to work, and it's missing a lot of these three methods that the interface has. So one way of doing that is we can just say implement the interface. We don't want to do it explicitly, just implement the interface, and it's going to add this code for us here. And again, right now the code doesn't do anything except throw an exception that says not implemented yet. but at least it sets up the structure the way we want it to be. So now, how this works is that we're going to want to tie into our adapter class. So let's look at a diagram that tries to show how this is working. So here's our insurance interface, and here's our in-network patient, and here's our methods that the insurance interface requires, and our in-network patient implements all of those, and also a constructor and a couple other things I didn't include in the diagram. Now, here's our outpatient network, and it implements some methods, but not the same ones as required here. So our network adapter is here, and inside the network adapter, we will create one of these patients, an out-network patient that we'll use. But we'll do some adapting from the interface. So out-network adapter will implement all these interfaces, but then it'll try to call the right interfaces over here. So for example, get patient name is a nice simple one. We have that here, but we also have that there. So we'll call, when this gets patient name, we'll just call the patient get patient name. Is covered, there's an is covered here, but it's a little different. Is covered here returns a string yes, no, and this returns a Boolean true, false. So we'll have to do some modifications. Also, this requires we're given two strings. The policy number here comes as a string. Here, the patient name's a string, and the policy number is an integer. So we're going to have to convert this string policy number into an integer policy number to send it down here. Similarly, for coverage amount, here we want to take a procedure cost and determine the coverage amount and return that as a decimal. But here we're given a procedure cost. We're just given a percent covered, and we're going to have to use that percent to figure out what to return here. So this is your job, is to implement this network adapter to do this, and I'll walk you through a little bit more on how to do that. So the first thing we want to do is, in our adapter, we're going to create and define an out network patient to create this relationship. And then we're going to create a constructor here. So let's do those two things first. So in our adapter up here, we're going to create a patient, instantiate a patient. So we're going to say out network patient. And give it some name. I'm just going to call it patient here. And then we're also going to need a constructor here for our out network adapter. We're going to need a constructor. Yeah, let's put this after the patient. What do we need? Well, inside that constructor, we're going to have to call the constructor for the out network patient. So we're going to have to say something like patient. Oops. So inside a constructor, we're going to say patient equals new, and then call out network patient, and we're going to have to specify a name and a policy number here. So inside here, we want this constructor to be the same. In fact, we want that to follow the same format basically as this constructor, a string new name and string policy. So we're going to just create the constructor the same way. So both constructors will work similarly, and when we construct an out network adapter, we'll pass this name on to the patient, and we'll pass on the policy number to the so basically, when we create one of these out network adapters, it's basically kind of a covering on our patient. So we'll create a patient, and we'll give that patient the same name and the same policy number. So inside the out network adapter, we're going to hide a patient with this characteristics, and we're going to use that patient inside here. So our out network adapter will manipulate this out network patient to fulfill the interface. Okay, so the main thing so here's our patient we've created, and our out network adapter constructor mirrors the out network patient adapter. So when we create an adapter, we'll create a patient and save that into our patient variable here. Okay, so we have our patient here. Now we have to make sure we implement all of these things. That's not, well, first let's try to do this in, see if we're able to do this in code and get this to work. So let's go back to our form where we're creating our different patients. We're going to create a new patient, and it's not going to be an out-network patient. It's going to be an out-network adapter, because that should implement our interface for us to work. I'm getting some error. Oops, it's inaccessible during protection ways. I forgot to make this a public network, I think, a public class. So I want to make sure I do that. And I'm still missing, and our constructor, I think, let's see, has to be, so let's make sure our constructor is public also. So after it compiles in the background, it should clear this up. So again, we can create an out-network adapter here, give it a name and an ID number or whatever. That'll go create an out-network adapter, and that will create a patient out-network patient for us. But this, the adapter, fulfills the interface, so we can use that here. So now if we run this, what it's going to do is try to get the name of all the patients when the form starts, and we'll get an error right away. Okay, so when we run this, it tries to go get the names of everything, but it doesn't, and so we don't see the right name out here for the new patient we added. So let's go look at that. And so the problem is that we're adding the patient here, but again, when we're trying to get the patient's name to add it to that pull down box, it's not, the get patient name isn't implemented. So let's go and implement that. So out patient adapter, get patient name. So let's look at our diagram again. So the interface, we should have get patient name, and that should call get patient name in the patient, in the out network patient. So here, rather than throwing this exception, we just want to get the patient's name. So again, we're just going to kind of pass this on. We have a patient that we've got internally. We're going to say patient dot get patient name, and we're going to return that. So we're just going to go out and get the patient's name and turn. We don't have to do anything. This gives us a string, and we want to return the string. Everything works very well, so that's nice and simple. So now if we run this, our new patient shows up. We can select a procedure. We can go to amount charged and check coverage for us. And now again, the coverage amount is going to vary and not work like how we want it, because we're giving an error here, so we've got to fix that. So the two things you've got to do as part of this assignment is in your out network adapter, I want you to modify coverage amount and is covered, and put in code to work with that. So let's walk through these a little bit. So is covered, let's go back to this. Is covered, the interface wants a Boolean, and we're given the name and the policy number. And what we have in the patient is a name and a policy number, but it returns a string. And that string is yes or no. So if we look at the out network patient, it returns yes or no, not a Boolean. So in here, you're going to have to call the patient is covered, and that will return yes or no, and then you've got to check, depending on that, you have to return either true or false here. So you've got to work with this so that it calls the patient gets the value from that and returns either a true or false rather than a yes or no. So you're going to have to put a little code here to do that, probably 3 or 4 lines of code to make that call. Similarly, up here, when we're calling the network coverage, we want to get an amount covered, and in our network patient, we only have a procedure for the percent, so we can get the procedure cost, pass that into here, and get the coverage percent. So here in our adapter, we're going to have to pass the procedure on to the patient, get the amount covered, and then to figure out the actual cost, we'll take the procedure cost times the amount covered, and we'll return that. You have to watch, you may have to convert between decimals and integers a little bit. Let's show you a little bit how to do that. So let's look at a little bit at converting strings to integers. In is covered, we're given a string of a policy number, but in our method out here for is covered in our patient, we're given a policy number as an integer, not a string. So we're going to have to work on that convert. So we would like to just be able to call the patient is covered and pass the patient name on and the policy number on. But there's an error here. It says cannot convert from string to int. And so we're going to add some code here to do that. We're going to declare an integer variable called int policy number. We're going to take the policy number and convert it to an int. So this is a string. There's a method inside the integer class or the integer object, int.parse. That'll convert a string into an integer. So we'll say int.parse. Now there's other ways of doing this, but this is a nice short simple way for us to do it in this code. Int.parse to convert this. And then we're going to use this integer policy number to convert here. And what we're given back is a string, and again, you're going to want to convert that string to a Boolean because this is a string yes, no, and if it's yes, you want to return true, and if it's no, you want to return false. And again, this is often the problem, or what adapters have to do is they have to do this conversions. There's code out here we can't manipulate or change, and we've got to run these conversions. So we've got to set up our methods that implement our interface, but then use the appropriate methods in the class out here and do the conversions there and back that are needed. So I just want you to get this to work. Make sure you get finish up is covered and coverage amount to work correctly. Good luck. Feel free to call or email or text me any questions you might have, or post them to the website.